I'm standing in the center of the green in historic Morristown, New Jersey, and I would like to introduce you to three of my new best friends. Say hello to General George Washington, Colonel Alexander Hamilton, and the Marquis de Lafayette. So why is there a statue of these three here in the center of the Morristown Green? Well, we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about the relationship between George Washington and Morristown. What these three men have in common is they all stayed at the Ford Mansion here in Morristown, which we will get to later. Now, what is happening in this scene is the Marquis de Lafayette is informing Washington that the King of France has agreed to support the revolution. And this is a really big deal. This is now May of 1780. And speaking of the King of France, the king is Louis XVI. And who is his wife? Well, if there's one French queen, for some reason that we all remember, it is Marie Antoinette. And why do we remember her? Well, probably because she said, let them eat cake. However, I hate to disappoint everybody, but there's no historical proof that she ever uttered those words. So let's talk about the three men themselves. You see here General George Washington. Notice how much taller Washington is than the other two. Washington was about 6'2", so he was tall. It's interesting in that the average man in colonial America was about 5'8". We have this misconception that people before us were like 1.5 feet tall. Not true. We have the Marquis de Lafayette. He comes to America at the age of 19, considered quite possibly the richest man in France, old family money, married old family money. He wants to be a part of this revolution. He gets a commission as a major general. He comes to America, becomes part of the army, and he becomes the son that Washington never had. We also have here Alexander Hamilton. Now, Washington first meets Hamilton, or Hamilton first comes to Washington's attention in the Battle of Princeton. So you may know the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. Well, that's the Battle of Trenton. After that, we have Assunpink Creek, which some people call the Second Battle of Trenton. And then we have the Battle of Princeton. And the British are holed up in Nassau Hall, and an enterprising captain of artillery comes up and he gets the British to surrender. Washington notices this and says, this is a man I'm going to keep my eye on. So that man, of course, is Alexander Hamilton, who becomes an aide to Washington and eventually becomes Washington what we would call chief of staff. So he's with Washington while Washington is here in Morristown both times. And we're going to talk more about Hamilton a little bit later, but right now let's take a walk around the green and I'll point out some historical things to you. So follow me. Let's take a walk across the green. Meanwhile, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Morristown. So Morristown was originally called New Hanover, and in 1739, the name was changed to Morristown, named after an earlier colonial governor named Lewis Morris, who was very, very popular. Now, colonial greens were the center of the towns back then. The courthouse would have been here, the jail would have been here, the hanging tree would have been here. Any kind of a public event or function would normally be in the greens. During the Revolutionary War time, the militia would train on the greens. So the greens in colonial America had a very important function in the towns. And usually the homes would be around the greens, and then on the other side of the homes would be the farms or the businesses, etc. We're going to walk up to a statue depicting a patriot leaving his family and going off to war. It's interesting about Morristown. There are a lot of statues in Morristown. I want to talk about one that's not here on the green, but it is in Morristown. As you leave the green, and you head up towards Mendham. On your left, you'll see a park called Burnham Park. And in this park is a really big statue. And most people, that statue does not register. They really have no idea what it's all about. Well, that's a statue of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was really important. In the beginning, he writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. Very important in that it persuades a lot of colonists who weren't sure if they wanted to separate or not to be for independence. Then he's with Washington's army. We're back to the Battle of Trenton again. And Washington's army is about to disband because a lot of the soldiers have a one-year contract, these contracts are about to expire. Washington needs to do something to keep his army together. Well, one thing that happens during this time is Thomas Paine writes another pamphlet called The American Crisis. It's kind of fun in that some of you may remember a song that was done by the Kingston Trio called the MTA. Well, the opening line of that song is, "These are the times that try men's souls." Well, that was written by Thomas Paine. That's the opening line from the American Crisis. Well, Washington is so taken by this pamphlet that he has it read to his army. That and some other things keep enough of his army together that he can still confront the British if need be. Now, the statue shows Thomas Paine writing the American Crisis. So the front of the statue is this long scroll, and if you go up and read it, you'll read the American Crisis. So there is a relationship between Thomas Paine and George Washington. Thomas Paine actually accompanies the army. He becomes like a war correspondent, kind of an early example. So at any rate, that's why that statue is there. If you go out that way, there's parking there. Take a look at the statue because it really is a cool statue. So we're now approaching another statue, which is right behind me. This is called Patriot's Farewell. And basically what you see here is really quite a moving statue we're going to go around the front, of course, of a soldier saying goodbye to his wife and his children as he goes off to war. There's Patriot's Farewell, the plaque, and as you come around the front, you'll see what really is a pretty moving scene. Let's talk about what brought George Washington to Morristown. So we want to talk about winter encampments and war during the wintertime. In colonial America and in Europe, whenever there was a war, there was generally no major fighting in the wintertime. The two opposing armies would go into what they call winter quarters. Now, they might send out small bands of men for specific purposes, but overall, they're stationary. We have the Battle of Trenton and Assunpink Creek and Princeton, as I mentioned. Now, this was the very end of 1776 into early January of 1777. Washington, his army are exhausted. They need to find a place where they can go into their winter encampment to recoup, and they come to Morristown. Why do they come to Morristown? Well, in the real estate world, it's location, location, location. Well, that's why Washington comes here. Number one, Morristown is in between Philadelphia and New York City, two major cities that Washington has correspondence with and back and forth. Congress is there, etc. The British are in New York, Congress is in Philadelphia. Secondly, and perhaps even more important, are the Watchung Mountains. Now, if you look on a map, you'll see there's this mountain ridge. Now, in our world today, it's not much of a mountain, but back then it was called a mountain. And this is kind of a natural defensive barrier between New York and Morristown. And really the only way to get through the mountains is what's called Hobart Gap. Now, those of you who live here in northern New Jersey, if you're familiar with the Short Hills Mall, well, that's Hobart Gap in that area. In fact, there's an actual road there called Hobart Gap. But if you're on 78 heading west, you're down, and then suddenly you go up and you go up and you go up. Those are the Watchung Mountains. So that gave Washington a good defensive place to stay for the winter and to have a lot of safety for his men because he could easily keep his eye on Hobart Gap should the British try to attack, which they did not. Washington comes to Morristown for the first time in January of 1777, and we're going to take a little walk this way, and we're going to go see where in relationship to the Green Washington stayed. So obviously it's a lot different today than it was then. All right, so Washington comes here, and Morristown was a little bit different then. Actually, it's a lot different than it is today. But Washington stayed at Arnold's Tavern, which is right here, just across from the Green. Of course, there's a street here now, but at the time, it just would have been land. And he stays in Arnold's Tavern. His men stay, the officers stay around the Green. The Army stays nearby. Now, the Army is not nearly as big as it was the second time Washington comes here, which I'll get into later. So Morristown, at that time, had a population of about 250 people. Now, in our world today, that sounds like it's tiny. I mean, we have condos and apartments bigger than that. But Morristown was, as I said earlier, in a unique location. So all of a sudden, here comes this army. Now, at that time, when Washington first comes here, the army is about 2,000 to 3,000. But imagine you're a town of 250, and here comes this deluge of people. But nonetheless, this was a good place for Washington. He comes here. Now, over on the corner, you see the sign Charles Schwab. I'm not promoting Charles Schwab, but right under there is a marker, and that's where Arnold's Tavern would have been. So this would have been the Green in colonial times. Obviously, the sidewalks would not have been here, the streets would not have been here. And as we walk down this way, this is the marker. We're going to go in the front. So Arnold's Tavern would have stood just about here. In fact, if you stand here and you look out, you can get a kind of an idea of what Washington would have seen. So let me point out the tavern sign up here, which I think could use a cleaning, but nonetheless. So this is the space where Arnold's Tavern would have been. It was owned by Jacob Arnold, as you can see. And as you stand here and you look across the way, you kind of get a feeling for what it was like in colonial times living right near the Green. Now, one of the interesting things about Washington's first stay here in Morristown has to do with smallpox. Medicine in colonial times was, I'll use the word primitive. Doctors had not reached the point where they knew really pretty much anything about what caused diseases, how to prevent diseases, how to cure diseases. And of all the diseases going, the most serious, the one that took the greatest toll, was smallpox. Now, they called it smallpox because if you got it, you got small pock marks on your skin. So they called it smallpox because they didn't know what else to call it. There's another disease at the time, malaria. Doctors didn't know what caused it and so on and so forth. They called it malaria, which is actually two French words, mal, which means bad, and area means air. So if you got it, they called it malaria. So Washington realizes and understands that inoculations, which were just starting, were really important because with these epidemics of smallpox, especially in the armies, his army could be wiped out, and we could lose the war for independence, not from fighting, but from disease. So he decides, while he's here in his first encampment in Morristown, to have his army inoculated. Now, Washington himself, if those who may not know this, had smallpox. Washington idolized his older half-brother Lawrence. Lawrence was ill. Now, Lawrence had what they called consumption, we call tuberculosis. This ran in Washington's family. It was decided that maybe warm weather would help Lawrence with this disease. Washington agrees to accompany Lawrence to Barbados, thinking maybe the warm weather will in some way help. Well, while in Barbados, Washington gets smallpox. Now, he does survive it, and one of the good things, if you could call having smallpox good, but is that once you've had it, you cannot get it again. So for all the war, at least there was no worry of the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army getting smallpox himself. Now, Washington never had children of his own. There is no one really knows for sure why not. But one of the thoughts is that the smallpox that he had basically left him unable to father children. Again, coming here the first time and inoculating the Army, besides being a gutsy move, because doctors didn't know for sure just how much of this live virus to insert under the skin, and sometimes they would insert too much. But nonetheless, Washington is credited, and rightly so, with maybe saving the Army just by the idea that at least smallpox would not be the terrible threat that it might have been. While we're walking around this way, we're heading over towards the Presbyterian Church, I want to talk about another Revolutionary War, actually an officer, he was a captain, from Morristown. His name was Peter Dickerson. Peter Dickerson owned a tavern called Norris Tavern or Dickerson's Tavern. Now, we're not going to go there. The only thing left is on the spot where there's now a commercial building, there's this little plaque. But if you were to just go straight as I'm doing and make a left turn, we're going to make a right turn, you'll come to this spot. Now, why am I talking about this? In January of 1780, now I'm jumping ahead a few years, but as long as we're in this spot, I might as well talk about this now. A trial happens in Dickerson's Tavern. And that trial is of a man named Benedict Arnold. Yep, the traitor. Except the trial is not about Arnold being a traitor, because it's not yet known that he has contacted the British and is thinking about changing sides. Arnold, for those of you who don't know it, in the beginning of the war, Arnold was a hero. He was pretty much the only officer winning anything. He was one of these, you could probably call him a military genius and not be far wrong. He was very successful in what he did, kind of like George Patton of World War II, but Arnold had his ghosts, if you will. He was very sensitive. He felt he was always being slighted, that nobody was recognizing his contributions to independence. He used a lot of his personal money to finance the Army, which actually left him with no money. Well, things happen, and in one attempt to capture Quebec City, Arnold was shot in the leg. Later, in 1777, and I mentioned earlier that the King of France agrees to support the revolution. Well, the reason, what happens is, to persuade him, is our victory over the British at Saratoga. Who was the hero of Saratoga? It was Benedict Arnold. And in that battle, Arnold is shot in the leg, the same leg that he was shot in up in Quebec. Well, that kind of ends his military fighting, for the moment at least. And so Washington appoints Arnold military governor of Philadelphia. Arnold goes to Philadelphia, and he falls in love with Peggy Shippen. Now, there's a whole controversy here that Peggy Shippen was probably complicit in Arnold contacting the British. There's a Major John Andre, and it's too long to go into. But Arnold and Peggy Shippen fall in love. Arnold and Peggy is from a very wealthy family, and Arnold, who always wanted to be of the elite, starts spending way beyond his means. Arnold eventually becomes accused of misappropriating government property for his own gain. Now, a lot of this, first of all, it's probably true, but everybody did it. Now, that does not make it right, everybody did it, but there was politics involved here. Arnold had his detractors. Arnold's detractors wind up having enough clout that Arnold is accused of profiteering. And he goes on trial here in Dickerson's Tavern. Arnold wanted the trial. He said, I want to clear my name. I am innocent. They have the trial, and the prosecutors don't really have proof, but Arnold is found guilty of 2 minor offenses. But to Arnold's mind, even 2, even minor, was not good enough. And many historians feel this was the final straw that drove Arnold over the edge, so to speak.